We are very excited to be joined by Anthony Clan, who is an independent journalist. He's the editor of The Klaxon down in Australia to break down some pretty stunning election results there. Welcome, Anthony.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Yeah, of course. So a lot of people are saying there are a lot of echoes of what just happened in Australia with what previously happened in Canada. Sort of a come from behind, in your case, really landslide victory for the incumbent party, the center-left party. Big disappointment from conservatives who had previously seemed like they could surge and pull off a victory. Not only that, the leader of the Conservative Party, confusingly Liberal Party in Australia, but in any case, Peter Dutton, just like Pierre Poilievre in Canada, actually lost his own seat. That's how bad the drubbing was. So just set up the dynamics here and give us a sort of top-level view of what happened.
Of course. So the election, the federal election, Australia's federal election, was held on Saturday. The government of the day is the Labor Party, which is sort of centre left. It's been in power for 3 years. The centre right party, much the same as Canada, was the opposition. It came in. It was quite strong. It was quite strong in the polls. It was looking like it was quite a good contender and perhaps even going to win in around November, December, about the time that Donald Trump came to power. And very similar to as we saw in Canada, which was also a centre-right opposition, the party sort of slumped in the polls over the early part of the year, particularly part of the campaign, the electoral campaign. The opposition here did particularly poorly, but it was an absolute drubbing. It was blood on the streets. It's an electoral wipeout. So there's sort of questions at the moment in Australia regarding the future of this Conservative Party. Obviously, it's still going to be there, but it's the number of seats has just been pretty much wiped out. So we saw in Canada the Conservative Party there was unsuccessful, and that the leader lost his seat. Same as in Australia. It's actually been quite a bit worse than Canada. There was talk of the current government in Australia being forced into a minority government rather than a majority government, but it's a majority government, and by a long way, by about 20 seats. So it's been it's quite the outcome.
Let's go ahead, guys, and put F1 up on the screen. This is a tear sheet of one of the articles your outlet wrote in advance of the election. You said coalition, that's the opposition party, headed for disaster, worst result in 80 years, according to this YouGov poll. Of course, us Americans love to think that everything is about us, but it does seem like Trump's policies and the backlash to such did have some reverberations in terms of this election. So help us understand how significant those dynamics were.
For sure. So there's quite a few issues at play here. So it wasn't just the Trump effect, as they're calling it, but it definitely had a substantial impact. And it's difficult to know exactly what caused people to vote on the day. But clearly, I think over President Trump's first 100 days since inauguration, you've seen international markets, stock markets roiled, a lot of uncertainty. And in those situations, people have voted for the incumbency, voted for the existing government, who have concerns with that sort of instability and the threats. It was also raised quite a lot regarding President Trump's threats against Canada, regarding tariffs, but also, the sort of the talk around annexing and that sort of thing made a lot of Australians a bit nervous, thinking, look, we're a very close partner with the US, as is Canada. This could be us. So I think that had quite a big impact. It's also noteworthy, the opposition leader here, he was very keen towards the end of last year, sort of saddling up to this sort of MAGA side of things, making America great again. He was sort of very, quite happy to be associated with that as the winds were to his back and to Donald Trump's back. But then as things sort of started to fall apart a bit and the wheels sort of started to fall off in the US regarding some of the more extreme statements from the president, we've seen that our opposition party sort of try to backpedal a bit and sort of said, oh, look, well, no, we're different. But by then it was very much in train. One particular noteworthy point during the campaign was we had the opposition leader standing next to a senator from his party, and his senator said, look, I'm here. She said, I'm here. I want to make Australia great again. And that sort of caused quite an issue because it was, that's MAGA right there. And she immediately said, look, no, it's not me. The media is obsessed with Donald Trump. And within 24 hours, there was a photo of her with a Make America Great Again cap holding a miniature Donald Trump that surfaced from a few months before. So that was an interesting point.
to the point of who's obsessed with whom with that one.
Exactly.
Well, it is interesting because, with Canada, obviously, like you were saying, the threats have been really overt. Canada and US, huge trading partners, and especially the threats to invade and annex Canada as the 51st state. Really, obviously, Canadians were not thrilled about that. And anyone who seemed like they were even tangentially associated with Trump and his politics then sort of, paid a price for that. I was listening to some Australia voters talk about why they voted the way that they did. And certainly the roiling of the markets and the way that's affecting people's, market accounts, et cetera, that was certainly a part of it. But it also just seemed like a general reaction against what was perceived to be an extreme direction from the US. I wonder if you could tease some of those things out as well. What were some of the things that Australians felt were coming from the US that were contrary to their values?
Yeah, for sure. Look, I think sort of this conservative populism, and there's quite a it was taking off quite well, or there's quite a bit of it going on last year. But it's difficult to tell. The polls were reflecting that the public wasn't as adverse to it as the actual electoral outcome states. But I think people were increasingly uneasy about this sort of this populism and this sort of extreme right wing. Extreme right-wing activity, as well as there was a lot of US-style sort of disinformation groups, astroturf groups, whatever you want to call them, that are sort of set up and pretend to be grassroots movements of ordinary Australians, when in fact they're sort of run by fossil fuels entities and sort of bad actors pretending to be someone they're not. So we've seen a lot of that surfacing in Australia the past 12 months, particularly. And I think people have become increasingly aware of that. And we obviously have a much smaller market in Australia. So when you have this sort of activity happening, it's easier when it is called out. It's easier for the broader public to see what's going on, because we're much smaller. There's many fewer moving parts. So I think a lot of that's played a part as well. People have looked at some of the issues in Australia. We have very similar issues going on as on the east coast of the US there, in particular regarding offshore wind turbines. Now, quite a few studies and experts have been looking into this area. We're finding a lot of disinformation groups, astroturf groups in the US that have sort of been pretending to be environmental groups, but are actually fossil fuel backed, fighting against these offshore wind turbines, obviously because fossil fuels want to continue their business model. A lot of those same groups, same entities, and same methods are being used on the east coast of Australia. So I think a lot more people were sort of waking up to that, and combining those two together was sort of recoiled somewhat and voted for the existing government.
One of the things that we've been trying to wrap our heads around here is how much sort of irrevocable damage Trump is doing. It's one thing, the trade war, okay, a new president can come in, they can change the policy, et cetera. But Mark Carney, in his victory speech, really spoke about a sense of real betrayal, and a sense that even if the particular politician in the White House changes or the policy changes, that there's been a breach in the relationship that is going to cause Canada to go in another direction, sort of regardless of what happens from here on out. And I was just wondering what the view is from Australia about the US, and whether there's been sort of an irrevocable change in the way that the US is viewed by Australians.
I think it's much less. It's not as hectically viewed as the Canadians have viewed it. Obviously, there's been a very different relationship between the way that the president has treated Canada and Australia, at least vocally so far. I think the Australian public and the Australian authorities are sort of thinking, hang on, we need to reconsider a bit our position. We've sort of relied extremely heavily on the US as a security partner and that sort of thing. I think the relationship will remain regardless. It's strong. It's not going anywhere. But I think it sort of made people think a little bit, hang on, maybe we should stand on our own 2 feet a little bit more, which, to some degree, that's obviously a good thing. And I don't think there's any, sort of terminal long-term damage done there. It's just made people sort of wake up a little bit. Yeah.
And what was the view of Anthony Albanese prior to this election? What are people's sense of his governance?
So he was swept to power, or came to power last 3 years ago. We have 3-year terms, which is quite unusual on the international stage, but 3-year terms he came to power. It had been 9 years of the Conservative government in power before then. Now, they'd sort of, as many governments do, they'd fallen into the trap of cronyism and corruption in parts. And during that period, interestingly, Australia fell further towards corruption than any other OECD nation, according to Transparency International, over that 9-year period. And that's with the exception of Hungary, with which Australia tied. So it's not very well known, but during that period, we're obviously a fairly high base, but we fell down the list substantially. A lot of that was due to Australia not having a National Integrity Commission, being a national body that oversees corruption or alleged corruption involving politicians. So the Albanese government, he came to power, he promised this brand new National Anti-Corruption Commission that was going to set up and have transparent hearings and all the rest of it to hold government officials to account. Now, he brought one of these bodies in, but they sort of kneecapped it behind the scenes and made it have actions all in secret, basically all its hearings in secret. So you don't know what it's doing, and it's been pretty much a major flop, and it's been criticised from all sides. So I think a lot of people were very disappointed in that. He sort of made a lot of promises for his first term that he didn't come through with. He was all about transparency and accountability, but as soon as he got in, that all went out the window. But I think what's happened over the past 6 months with what's happened in the US and the Trump factor, then people have thought, well, look, we'll kind of forget about that for now. We've got bigger issues. We don't want this conservative government coming in. And it's basically a few of the issues with the conservative government. They're sort of, as the public's pointed out, they were behind in the times, looking to rewind Australia a little bit, rather than embracing renewable energy, of which we have plenty of, sun and wind. They were looking at actually introducing nuclear power in Australia for the first time, despite the fact it was going to cost between 2 and 5 times as much for no real reason. It was just sort of an ideological issue. So people were sort of not particularly happy about that. But so it wasn't a good opposition for starters. But the Trump effect obviously played a pretty big role.
Yeah, and I think I read Dutton had said something about having a nuclear reactor in his riding that his opponent seized on. And how long he had held that seat for, 24 years, something like that?
That's right. Yeah, more than 2 decades. And it had been on a small margin. He had it by about 1.4%, I believe, the seat of Dixon in Brisbane, which is halfway up the Australian coast. So there were a few questions as to whether he was going to hold that seat, but he's lost it quite convincingly, of about 6% swing against him. Now, this issue with the nuclear reactors was something that's we picked up on quite early on in the piece, and it was coming from a lot of the same actors, the fossil fuels groups. One of these in particular in Australia is called the Institute of Public Affairs. Now, it's sort of a proxy almost for fossil fuels interests. And this is where Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, launched his nuclear reactor policy about 18 months ago. So he actually launched it, this fossil fuels lobby group. And you're looking at these things, these small modular nuclear reactors that he was spruiking. They don't actually exist anywhere in the world on a commercial basis. And they were going to cost about 6 times more than normal electricity anyway. So it was pie in the sky sort of stuff. And it was seen by many experts as just a way of prolonging fossil fuels. So obviously they opened themselves up to this whole huge issue of nuclear power in Australia, and beyond the economics of it, you've got the issue of we haven't had nuclear power before, so a lot of people sort of are a bit uneasy about the idea, and it brings up the whole spectrum of nuclear energy. And obviously, he left himself open there, and the question was, hey, look, would you have a reactor in your backyard, in your electorate? And he said, of course. And obviously, people in his electorate weren't so keen about that.
Right. They were not so excited about that idea. Last question for you. How did some of these independent movements like the Teals, how did they play into these election results?
Yeah, so Australia has much the same as the US, 2 major parties, not quite as tied in as the US, but we have 2 major parties. Last election, there's a group of independents that came about. They were called the Community 200 Independents. Basically, fundraising model was set up to get independence into government, because usually you've got all the same actors, the fossil fuels, the big banks, etc., that are funding the 2 major parties. So this was sort of a new model that came in, and they were very successful, and they called it the Teal Wave last time around. Half a dozen or more independents came into power. This time around, those same independents are there. There's been a landslide to the ALP, to the existing government, which is centre-left. They have the majority of power, but the independents from last time, the Teal Wave, is still there. Most of those people, if not all of them, are back in again, as well as with a couple of other gains. And that's more of a long-term strategy to get more independents into government, into Australian government, with the idea being there's less power to the original backers, the original donors of the 2 major parties.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Anthony, so much for joining us and helping us to understand what's going on there. Tell people where they can find you and follow your work.
Oh, thank you. You can find us at theklaxon, klaxon.com.au, and we're an investigative news site covering all the stories that the other majors aren't. Thank you.
Fantastic. Great to meet you, and thank you again for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.